From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Ted Widmer. I'm the director of the John W. Kluge Center here at the library. And I want to thank Rob Kasper of the Poetry and Literature Center for all he did to include our center, including all of our scholars who are here tonight. I want to take this opportunity to invite you to silence your cell phones and any other electronic devices. And also after the panel discussion, we will have a Q&A that will be live streamed. And if you choose to ask a question, which I hope you will, you give permission to the library to broadcast yourself. So choose your question carefully. I have a special reason for rejoicing this evening. I was in a huge audience on the main green of Brown University, my former employer, and the alma mater of Marilynne Robinson when she was given an honorary degree in 2012. I was so far across that green that I couldn't even see her, and I'm grateful to the library for hosting this event because I will have a much better seat. While in Rhode Island, I was the director of a rare books library that specialized in early American history, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and we all felt a special debt of gratitude to Marilynne for breathing new life into the old spiritual questions that had so deeply moved these very early Americans, all too often consigned to the so-called dustbin of history. In our small part of the country, her wonderful books have always felt like letters from a friend. But she's also, of course, a great national figure in our Republic of Letters, and that's why tonight's award means so much. We have some extraordinarily literate people here to assess her impact, so I will conclude these introductory remarks by simply saying welcome and thank you for being here. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Director of National and International Outreach here at the library, the former Director of the Kluge Center and the former President of Bryn Mawr College, Dr. Jane McAuliffe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. It's great to see all of you here tonight to help us honor the work of Marilynne Robinson, winner of the 2016 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. So welcome to the library. And I also want to welcome our online audience, especially the Congregational United Church of Christ in Iowa City, where Marilynne served as a deacon for many years. The Prize in American Fiction stands as one of the highest honors that the library bestows on a living American writer. It seeks to commend strong, unique, enduring voices that have told us something new about the American experience. For those of you who weren't at the National Book Festival last September, when the Librarian of Congress presented Marilynne with her prize, I can tell you that our winner had a lively and insightful conversation about her work with the festival's literary director, Marie Arana. No single conversation, however, could capture the power of Marilynne's work, which has received many of the country's other top honors, including the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the National Humanities Medal. Which brings us to tonight's event, a conversation we're calling Fiction, Faith, and the Imagination. We have an amazing panel here with us, including two Pulitzer Prize winners, Geraldine Brooks and Paul Harding. Paul studied under Marilynne at the famed Iowa Writers' Workshop. We're also joined by the renowned American physicist, Alan Lightman, and Dr. Steven Knapp, president of George Washington University, will moderate the discussion. And of course, Marilynne is here with us tonight as well. One of Marilynne's great admirers is former President Barack Obama. He couldn't be with us tonight, but he sent a special surprise message for Marilynne. Please let me read President Obama's words. Like most Americans, I first met Marilynne Robinson on the pages of one of her extraordinary novels. For me, it was Gilead, a book I'd picked up as I was barnstorming across Iowa during my first campaign for president. In it, I met folks who were decent and good-hearted, full of their own complexities and struggles. I was absorbed into a story that grapples equally with the blossoms and the thorns in our relationships, with each other, with ourselves, with our Creator, and still manages to achieve a level of grace that we are all striving for in our own lives. That's what Marilynne does so brilliantly. She not only draws us into the texture of the people and the communities she creates, but wraps us all together in something larger, a patchwork of characters and readers and author, of our struggles and our delights, of our faith, our doubts, our redemption. And in so doing, she elevates our understanding of what it means to be fully human. That's what the highest of art can achieve. It's what the greatest library in the world should celebrate. And it's what Marilynne Robinson seems to radiate every time she sits down to write. So I want to once again congratulate my friend Marilynne on her distinguished award. And I want to thank you all for gathering together tonight for something that, for Marilynne, might be an even greater reward, a thoughtful, lively conversation on some of the topics dear to all our hearts. Have a great night, everyone. On that lovely note from President Obama, please let me turn this evening over to President Steven Knapp.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Poetry and Literature and the Kluge Center and their directors, Robert Kasper and Ted Widmer, respectively, for hosting this event here at the Library of Congress. And I want to say at the outset how honored I am to be moderating such a distinguished panel, as you've already heard. I do think that President Obama has just done a great job of opening the panel discussion, but I'm going to still say a few things before I start posing some questions to our panelists. So our topic is the relation between faith and imagination. And I'm really not aware of a more compelling instance of that relation in modern fiction than the way Marilynne Robinson reimagines the Christian, and more specifically, the Calvinist conception of divine grace in the three novels of her Gilead trilogy, and those are Gilead, Home, and Lila, of course. She does so in part through a remarkable elaboration and transposition of the most famous imaginative depiction of divine grace in the New Testament, the so-called parable of the prodigal son in the Gospel of Luke. A man has two sons, and the younger asks for his inheritance in advance. The father grants the request, the son goes off, squanders his patrimony through dissolute living, and returns home impoverished and disgraced. His father not only forgives him, but amazingly throws a party in his honor. The elder son, who has always been dutiful and obedient, objects to this special treatment, but the father gently rebukes him, explaining that this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. I think I could show how echoes of this parable pervade Robinson's trilogy, but it's most obviously evoked by the middle novel, Home. Home begins with a child's return to a father, only this child, named Glory, is a younger sister, not a brother. Her only sin was misplaced trust in a fiancé who jilted her. She isn't greeted by any sort of party, and she quickly assumes the role of the dutiful and obedient caregiver of her ailing father, Presbyterian minister Robert Boughton. The real prodigal son, her elder brother Jack, soon comes home as well, and much of the novel focuses on his difficult and never quite finished reconciliation with their father. Jack, who remains the father's favorite despite his delinquent childhood and his many years' absence from the family home, eventually leaves before disclosing the act that would have been his greatest sin in his father's eyes, but is also the source of his own moral redemption, his marriage to an African-American woman and his fathering of a mixed-race son. Jack's wife Della and son Robert show up at the family home just after Jack has left, so Glory, but not the father, finds out the truth. The novel ends with Glory prophesying in her own imagination the day when Jack's son Robert will return to the homestead, truly answering his father's prayers in a way that Jack never quite answered his own father's prayers. And that Glory sees as the long-delayed but infinitely merciful expression of God's grace. Now, that only scratches the surface of Robinson's treatment of the theme of grace, explicitly analyzed by the terminally ill protagonist and narrator of the first novel, the Reverend John Ames, and reworked in an entirely new way through the thoughts of his religiously uneducated and much younger wife, Lila, protagonist and namesake of the third novel. But what gives Robinson's exploration of grace its imaginative depth is not just the variety of personal angles from which she approaches it, but the subtle way in which she connects those personal stories with the salient movements and events that inform or surround them. Abolitionism, the Civil War, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Throughout the trilogy, these elements of history sometimes lie dormant, sometimes haunt the present, sometimes break violently through the surface of her narrative. So I'd like to start our discussion, and I think I'll start with you, Geraldine Brooks. Again, our topic is fiction, faith, and imagination. As I've just suggested, one of the fascinating elements of Robinson's fiction is the way she weaves together religious concerns with a rich historical context. What's your sense of the way that works in her novels?
Marilynne Robinson's novels temporally are situated in the near past. It's not traditionally what would be described as historical fiction. It's in, what I like to think of as Henry James's designated safe zone, because James famously once observed that any attempt to write about a period more than 50 years removed from one's own is worthless and should not be attempted. Because the old consciousness will be too elusive to us. But actually, if you think about it, if you're a novelist in the middle of the journey of your life, that 50-year window added to the 50 years of your own experience gives you an entire century in which to ply your trade, which is a not ungenerous period of time. And I think in the case of Marilynne's luminous novels, this is very important because I can't imagine Gilead set after 1960. I think it is much better set in the slightly more distant past. Perhaps if you wanted to look for a dividing line, it would be before you could possibly have a Time magazine cover that said, "Is God dead?" I think you're in a time period where the corrosive influence of materialistic skepticism has not yet eroded the social fabric of at least the English-speaking world to the extent that happened perhaps after the 60s. It reminds me of a wonderful essay by James Wood in his collection, The Broken Estate, where he talks about how the novel itself was, in a way, corrosive to faith, because the novel is an as-if form. You're creating as if, but you're not creating certainty. And he talks about the very few brilliant writers who are able to retain a mysticism and a religious element in their fiction with the true belief in fiction itself and the purposes of fiction. And he singles out Virginia Woolf and talks about the sort of gentle dalliance that she has between religion and mysticism. And I think that Marilynne Robinson is not a gentle dalliance at all. It is a passionate, sweaty congress. And I think it works very beautifully because she sees the mystical and the religious in the ordinary. It doesn't have to be a virgin birth to be wonderful, because any birth is a miracle, as Ames's love for his young son, so beautifully evoked, demonstrates. And then I think of that wonderful passage where Ames reflects that light is constant, and we just turn over in it. And every day is one day. And once you have that thought, then who needs to argue whether the world was created in 6 days? It becomes a magnificent irrelevancy. You can have the faith without.
Thanks very much. Thank you. So, Alan, you're among other things, a novelist. You have many roles, but you're also a novelist who's written Mr. G, a speculative novel about the ultimate reality. You're also a scientist, and as we know, some prominent scientists in recent years, and this relates to the corrosive materialism that Geraldine just mentioned. You've noticed how in recent years scientists have been highly critical of religion and tend to affirm evidence-based reasoning in contrast to reliance on faith. Defenders of religion often respond by arguing that science itself relies on its own kind of faith. What's your take on that? Does faith play a role in science, and if so, what kind of faith, and how do you think about that in relation to your own imaginative engagement with both religion and science?
Well, I think for me, faith is belief in something that you can't prove. And the folklore is that everything that science believes it can prove, and nothing that religion believes it can prove. I think that that science and religion have very different methods of arriving at their beliefs, but I think there is faith in both. And the faith in science is something that's very, very fundamental, the kind of faith that scientists have. It's something that one might call the central doctrine of science. And the central doctrine of science is that the universe is lawful and logical. It's a doctrine that we scientists learn as graduate students. We may not learn it consciously, but it's sort of in the air. It's a belief that just osmosis into the skin. It's a fundamental working belief that scientists have. And it's a belief that can't be proved. It has to be taken on faith, because no matter how much science knows, and no matter how successful our theories are, they're incomplete. There are things that we don't know, which Marilynne has talked about, things that science doesn't know, and we can't be certain that all parts of the universe are lawful and logical. We don't know for sure whether some new phenomena discovered tomorrow will be lawful and logical. We can't be certain. So the belief in the central doctrine that everything in the physical universe is lawful and logical, that is something that has to be taken on faith.
So you've also expressed an interest at times in the relation between physical and non-physical conceptions of reality. Can you say maybe a little bit more about that as a physicist, and
Yes.
how you think about the non-physical?
Well, Marilynne has written wonderfully about science and religion, and she suggests in her writing that that we make too much a deal out of the difference between the physical and non-physical, that we make too big a distinction. What she says, and please correct me, Marilynne, if I'm getting you wrong, she says that because the knowledge of science about the physical universe is incomplete, that we can't confidently make an opposition between the physical universe and a non-physical universe, because we don't really fully understand the physical universe. Well, I agree with part of that. but not all of it. I do agree that the knowledge of science about the physical universe is incomplete. But for me, as both a scientist and a humanist, and if I can say a spiritual person, I think the distinction between the physical and the non-physical universes is very important. I think that there are experiences that we have, and probably everybody here has had them, you could call them transcendent experiences, that science will never be able to explain even in principle, will never be able to fully comprehend. You can hook 100 billion electrodes to my neurons and measure every electrical output of each neuron, but that will not explain the experience that I have in looking at the stars at night, or the feeling that there's something larger than myself. That's, for me, is part of the non-physical universe. If we believe in God, if God exists, every religion that I know of has a conception of God in which God does not live in time and space. God is not subject to laws and rules. And so God would also be a part of what I would call the non-physical universe. On the other hand, I am a strong subscriber to the central doctrine of science, having said all of that. And I do think that there is a vast range of phenomena that science does understand, that science can explain, that is subject to the laws that we understand, and I call that the physical universe. So I need to have a distinction between those two universes to live a life both as a scientist and as a humanist.
Do you want to say a little bit about how your novelistic interests fit into that? How your interests as a writer of fiction yourself are related to that distinction?
Well, I wrote a book, a novel called Mr. G, and that's a lowercase g, standing for God. And it's a book that tells the story of creation from the point of view of God. God is the narrator of the book. God has an uncle and an aunt who are always chastising him for not getting things right. And the universe that God creates is a lawful universe. God considers the possibility of entering the universe and intervening and performing miracles, which would be unlawful and would violate the central doctrine of science. But God chooses not to do that. And for me, this was an important exploration for me to think about how this physical and the spiritual universes could exist in harmony with each other without any contradiction.
So we've talked a little about how the imagination engages the not too distant past. We've talked now about how the imagination negotiates the path between the call them physical and non-physical dimensions of our experience. Now I want to shift to a slightly more personal take on Marilynne Robinson's career, and that has to do, Paul, with her role as a teacher. And of course, as it happens, you've been a student of hers, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about what that experience was like, and does the intersection of faith and imagination also play a role in the classroom, in her classroom?
Sure. Well, I can say that it was a good experience to be Marilynne's student. Just to start anecdotally, I had the experience of having been a drummer in a rock band for many years, and when the rock band broke up and came time for me to get a job, there was some terror to that prospect, so I thought, I'll just go to grad school. And And like a lot of writers, people who become writers, I was a reader, and I thought of myself as a writer long before I wrote anything. I just walked around saying, I'm the writer in the family, you know. And so I finally had the opportunity to take a fiction writing class at Skidmore College in Saratoga, and just by the luck of the lottery, I signed up for a class, and Marilynne Robinson walked in, and within 10 minutes of her starting to talk about the life of the mind, art, spirituality, history, I knew that that's the life I wanted for my own mind, or at least to try to emulate that. And so I was lucky enough to be able to follow her out to the Iowa Writers Workshop at the University of Iowa. I think the day I found out I got into Iowa was the day I found out that she had won the Strauss Living Award and was not going to be in Iowa while I was a student there. But I had to figure out how to make my breaks. And so she taught a class in the Old Testament at the Congregational Church in Iowa City. So I think that was the first time I studied the Old Testament with her. And I've used the analogy before, but being able to study with Marilynne is like the difference between sitting in a seminar room and studying Paradise Lost and sitting in a seminar room with John Milton. It really is that profound. And she taught me fellowship. She taught me how to treat other human beings with reverence, which as a skeptic, fresh from sophomore, my sophomore skepticism class, I was not in the habit of granting other people reverence or respect in a way that, was like running into the best brick wall you could ever run into. And I think that's all of these things sort of align telescopically in the way that she teaches, the way that she thinks, the way that she writes, the way that she models the life of the mind, the intensity and the honesty of it. She often says that your job as a fiction writer is to write sentences that are true, which is that contradicts sort of a lot of sort of anecdotal sort of kind of thing that fiction writers get on stage and they say, well, I had to become a fiction writer because I'm a pathological liar. It's, and so then over the years, I had never considered religion. I grew up innocent of religion. I would say innocent just in the strict sense of I did not go to church. My family was neither antagonistic toward religion or sympathetic with it. And so at a certain point, though, admiring Marilynne as much as I did, it occurred to me that if I were to ask her what the source of her artistic and intellectual sophistication was, she would say her religion. And being inclined to respect her, I thought, well, maybe I better look into this theology business and faith. And so I also wanted to be able to have something to talk about with her when I cornered her for coffee, which is another story. But and so I read Calvin's Institutes, and I started reading Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, and we started having these wonderful conversations that haven't ended yet. And so I think it's, the theologian Karl Barth says that we are all ordained to fellowship. And I think that's one of the things that is really, struck me deeply and has never stopped resonating. And so I would say that the intersection of her faith and the imagination, I don't know that she'd make a distinction. Just in terms of, and she's written about this, but I think she thinks of her faith, and I'm paraphrasing, so it's not like, oh, I just think she might. But I think she thinks of her faith as a given of experience, one of the great givens. It's phenomenological, to put it in secular terms, and it's a gift. She cites William James with that, and she says, as she said, she takes an exalted view of experience, and so she never openly proselytizes in class or anything, but she embodies the virtues of the best parts of her own faith and of grace, and by embodying them, inspires her students.
Good, thank you. That's a terrific tribute. I do want to say that as a sometime scholar of Milton, you would not have enjoyed a seminar with John Milton quite to the same.
It shows poorly, apparently. It's just a quality of mind, maybe not like personal.
Yeah. Different pedagogical
Shakespeare.
approach.
Maybe
So I'm really struck by what you said about, and maybe she can comment on this at some point, but about Marilynne Robinson's not really drawing as much of a distinction between faith and imagination as one might anticipate. I'd kind of like to hear what each of the panelists has to say about that question, and that is how close is the relation between faith and imagination, and how do each of you sort of experience that? Because one could say that in these novels, as one has an extraordinarily intimate engagement with the consciousness of the characters she depicts, sometimes that line, becomes a little bit difficult to draw. I mentioned the sort of prophetic moment at the end of Home where Glory imagines decades in the future when a fulfillment of this story of grace will occur, and who knows whether it actually will or not. That's in a way, it's a gesture of faith, but in another sense, it is a moment of imagining. And I just wonder if maybe each of and we could start with anyone who's interested in taking this up, how do you think about the distinctions and similarities, overlap, interpenetration of faith and imagination?
I actually feel very sorry for people who don't have any kind of religious education. I've had 2 separate ones, possibly even 3. I was raised Roman Catholic in a very traditional Baroque Irish style, educated by nuns, and I think that the great gifts of that time were capacity for abstract thought, because when you tell a 7-year-old that there are 3 persons in one God, you are really opening up the idea of abstract thought in a very particular way. And the other thing I'm grateful for is the sense of metaphor that you get. I remember benediction and the litany of Mary and the long list of ways that you can evoke Mary as the lily of the valley, the star of the sea, the mystic rose. So I think that religion opens you up to imagination. In later life, I've embraced Judaism, which some would say is a much more hard-headed piece of business, and also studied Islam very closely in my years as a foreign correspondent, living among the women of Islam who had made a very different choice to my own, which was to embrace an orthodox version of faith that I found very confounding, and I wanted to explore why they had done that. But I loved what Marilynne once said when somebody asked her if she'd had an ecstatic religious experience, and she said, that would be wasted on me, because she finds the ordinary so numinous. And I think that that is what a religious imagination gives you, is a sense of noticing the divinity in the ordinary. And that's why I like Jewish prayer so much, because most of it is about being grateful for noticing the dew on the grass, the first sliver of the new moon, blessing the bread and the wine and your children every single Friday night. And that is a good habit of mine to get into, I think.
Anyone else? You want to pick that up at all, Alan?
Well, I think of faith as belief in the unseen. And to me, that's very close to the imagination. Because in the imagination, we are creating things in our minds that may not be concrete, that may not be visible, and yet they are ideas that motivate us, that provoke us, that stimulate us. And so that's a connection that I see at a fairly low level between faith and imagination.
Yeah, I think the act of creating art, the act of cultivating your imagination, the discipline of observation, the discipline of being able to observe things as intensely and as closely as possible, and render them onto the page aesthetically, to put aesthetic pressure on them in the case of writing fiction, is an act of devotion. It's an act of obedience. It's an act of prayer. With that beautiful kind of commerce between it's in your mind, so there's this kind of onto-epistemological sort of state where your mind is generating these sort of aesthetic productions and working with metaphors that are sort of bound to, they build up and then they topple and you build them up again, but then you end up with this book that goes out into the world, and as a writer, you understand that this book is going to interact with other people and their lives, and it's going to have this, again, back to sort of fellowship, but also the act of faith. These works of art have to be made in good faith because they're going to go out and affect other people's lives.
It occurs to me that one of the ways in which the interplay of faith and imagination works in Marilynne Robinson's fiction in particular has to do with the way persons engage each other and try to understand each other, and that it's the mystery of other persons becomes an occasion for, it's almost as if you can only engage other people through an act that's simultaneous, an act of faith and imagination. I'm thinking of the various efforts that characters make to understand each other, whether it's John Ames trying to understand his slightly mad grandfather and the relation between his father and his grandfather, Lila trying to understand this new world and sort of feel her way into the alien world of John Ames and his theology, or everyone's trying to understand Jack and what makes him work, and he doesn't seem to quite understand himself and almost has to engage himself in the same way. So there's this constant sense of an engagement with mystery when you're dealing with persons. So it's not just the sort of a supernatural realm; it's actually the everyday interchange of human relations that becomes this occasion for faith and imaginative engagement with others. There's another element to this which we haven't brought into it, but it's been sort of at the edges of what we've been talking about, and I think this is something, Geraldine, you said you might have an interest in talking about, and that's the element, we've been talking about pretty ponderous and grand subjects here, but there's also an element of wit and humor that I think you wanted to kind of make sure you didn't ignore.
Yes.
So if you could maybe take us in that direction a little bit.
Yeah, I think everybody is so awed by the grandeur and the achievement and the penetration into the soul that Marilynne achieves, but they're very funny books. In places, extremely funny books. And I think of some of the characterizations in Housekeeping, where everybody is struggling to understand each other. And there's this just wonderful sense of the essential unknowability of even the people that you're closest to and you love the most, and why did they do that? But scenes that just made me smile and chuckle, the good women of Fingerbone coming to see about the children with the best will in the world is so deliciously invoked. And then my other favorite scene is in Gilead, the characterization of Ames's father and his grandfather when they're very, very angry at each other. And every sentence ends with "Reverend," thrown as a javelin. So yeah, I think that the wit is something that should not be either overlooked or underestimated.
Does that also come through in the classroom, would you say, Paul?
Absolutely, yes. Just wicked isn't the right word, but dry, understated, profound. Sometimes, yes, I'll just leave it at that.
Another, I talked about the theme of grace, but there's another biblical theme that sort of runs through these novels, and it has to do with an interest in outsiders. And I think, Paul, you had mentioned an interest in the biblical emphasis on social justice, and especially as it's figured as the commandment to care for the stranger, the widow, the orphan, and so on. Can you talk a little about it? I know you're interested in that element of the fiction, because you can talk a little bit about that, perhaps.
Well, I think it begins with just the lives that she has taken the time to devote her attention to. And I mean, but as you say that, I'm particularly thinking about Lila in this case, where she is poor, she is an orphan, she's Ruth weeping in the alien corn, or whatever this line from the Keats poem is, and just by the act of devoting and sort of lavishing that quality of attention on lives that would otherwise go unremarked is of a piece with that, like the act of obedience, the act of faith, the act of the imagination being a kind of gesture of fellowship towards these lives that would not be otherwise noted, and the kind of lives that sort of get swept into the corners because all of the kings and the princes and the judges are up to no good, and this is another thing about if one thing makes the Lord angry, it's not taking care of the widow and the stranger and the hungry and the orphan.
So in the trilogy, there's an absent version of this that is nevertheless kind of haunts all the narratives and only really surfaces explicitly at moments, and that's the racial division of the country, which obviously is something that everyone is so strongly focused on in our culture today. And of course, it comes in and out, but it's always in the background, and even going back to the tension between the father and grandfather in Gilead, and it's another version of this question of otherness. And I wonder if anybody would like to say anything about their sense of how the racial dynamics play out in all of these writings. Anyone want to comment on that?
I think that that's perhaps the most magnificent achievement of Gilead, is that it is a story about love, and it's a very intimate portrayal of love, but it's managed to digest this elephant, which is who are you when conscience demands something of you? And there are so many different answers given to that question, and as Ames is writing to his young son, he talks about that fierce old urgency, and that is such a great characterization of the question that the Civil War asked of everybody that was required to live through it. Who were you? How did you respond? I lived for a while not far from here in a Quaker town, Waterford, Virginia, which was settled in 1733 by Quakers, and was one of the few places where free blacks could live unharassed in Virginia before the Civil War. But when the war came, a number of young men in that town faced the terrible choice: which was the greater evil, violence or slavery? And some of the young men in that town made the choice to take up arms and fight against slavery, but that meant that they were read out of meeting in the town. And I think that those choices that we make as individuals are really what Marilynne is so exquisitely gifted at exploring. Who makes what choice? What are the ramifications of it?
So someone mentioned earlier this numinous character of the ordinary that I think comes through. You mentioned it coming through in the teaching and coming through in the fiction. We haven't talked very much about the rather pervasive role of weather, seasonal change, the interface of the things happening on the edges of a town. I mean, a town that's already in a rural setting, and then the way characters move through that landscape and so on, and what happens to them in their engagement with nature. And I think you had an interest in saying a little about nature. I think you had you talked about Calvin's interest in nature as the shining garment in which God is both revealed and concealed. And it's a little bit related to what we're saying about the physical, but a slightly different angle on it, I think. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the role of the natural world, not as a physical universe, but specifically the landscape, the climate, the weather, the seasonal change.
I think the description of the lake in Housekeeping, the lake is almost as important a character as any of the human beings. The lake has a voice, and the lake has a presence, and the lake will come and infiltrate your life and change how you can live. And I think that modesty in the face of nature is something that we all need to be a little bit more ready to concede.
I think of it in terms of, partially anyways, the sort of transcendentalist tradition. I think of Emerson, I think of Wallace Stevens as well, who I consider an honorary transcendentalist, and Emily Dickinson. And it reminds me of a line in Housekeeping that I always think of when Ruth is, I think she's in the bottom of the boat, and she's bottom of a boat, and they're going across the lake, and she's very tired, and she closes her eyes and allows her mind to become coextensive with the darkness. And so I think when I read landscape, I just read it as a projection of character. It's coextensive with character. It is again, it's sort of phenomenological. It's experiential. Landscape does not exist independently of the perception and the experience of it. And so there's a refractive kind of quality to it. It's always the objective landscape is being refracted through an experiencing subject, and so it becomes another numinous, luminous, beautiful way of rendering character.
And also, I think another really indelible moment for me is the description of Ames and his father at the gravesite, and it's an ugly piece of land. But then, in a moment when it's decked with light, it becomes beautiful. And again, it's a little bit Thoreau. Only that day dawns to which I am awake.
And the sun is setting and the moon is rising, and they're creating skeins of light. Is, I think,
it is an amazing moment. Did you want, Alan, as a scientist, how do you think about the role of landscape?
Well, I think our relationship to nature is extremely interesting and complicated. And I think there's one metaphor of nature, of Mother Nature, that nature is going to take care of us, maternal feeling that nature comforts us. But then, on the other hand, we have earthquakes that kill thousands of people, natural disasters. I remember being out on the ocean in a small boat for the first time by myself with my wife, and looking around and seeing nothing but water in every direction, no land in sight. And I felt like I was in a vast place that didn't care about me at all. There was no sense of some consciousness there. And so I think there's a tension between these two different views of what nature is and our relationship to nature that can be found in our literature and our history and anthropology and everything else.
But at least you were there to notice that nobody noticed you.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Well, so you may have noticed that we have an empty chair on stage here, and it's actually not for Elijah, which is what you may have been thinking. And so I think we'd now be, I would certainly be honored, and I think we all would be, if perhaps Marilynne Robinson herself might join us on the stage for a few moments. So I think the idea now is that we would invite you to react a little bit to what you've heard, or add whatever you'd like to add, or take us in whatever direction you want to take us.
Well, first of all, I have to say that this is like the most self-indulgent fantasy I have ever had.
Well, we try to do that in Washington.
This is better than most. Well, you know, it's just fascinating. I couldn't be more pleased. I think that Paul has said something very descriptive, which is that I'm so immersed in my own particular habit of thought that I do tend to try and, you know, do variations on it, you know, look through it as a prism or a lens. It's, you know, I have become sort of deeply immersed in theology that I basically inherited, although I was unaware of it, you know, a little Presbyterian, knowing nothing about what I was being taught. But then I began to realize that it was a serious theology, highly available to me, and that I felt as if you know, if you granted its terms, it can tell you certain kinds of things. Another theology might tell you other things, you know. This was the one that I found myself engrossed by. And it has a certain emphasis. One of them is the idea, which you find very much in writers of this tradition, especially the earlier ones, that the beautiful is the signature of God. And that it's almost a question of individual consciousness whether or not you perceive the beautiful. And the assumption is more or less that it is always there one way or another to be perceived, you know? And so you know, the beauty of creation is implicit. People have to learn how to see in order to see it. The farther you go into seeing it, the more the richness of it becomes apparent to you. I find this to be a very, very fruitful way for me to think, in any case, you know, what, in the moment of interaction between two people, what passes between them that could be called beautiful, you know. And another thing that I like very much about it is the humanism of it, the assumption that every encounter between two people, between oneself and another, is a question being posed by God. And your question is, what does God want from this interaction? But the way in which it's articulated as an idea is that the other being an image of God virtually is God, because all interactions have that degree of theological weight. The other is God, the other is Christ, you know? And again, from the point of view of making inquiries into your experience as a mortal human being, you know, there's almost no more, you know, radically illuminating question than what would God want from this situation? Because as it's articulated, God either is the other person or is very deeply sympathetic with the other person, you know. And I think that that's a kind of an aesthetic, an ethical aesthetic that is very moving to me. And that, you know, these are probably the two assumptions that come out of my own religious background or theology that I find to be most useful to me as a novelist.
Very good, very good. So are there elements of what you heard from the panel up here that you wanted to push back on in any way?
Dr. Lightman is going to know that I'm going to, no. I mean, it comes down to a question of what you call real. For example, if you look at something and find it saturated with an aesthetic value, including, you know, reality at the level of Planck lengths, if that is beautiful, then the beauty is a thing that exists also. You know what I mean? I mean, there's that level of comprehension or understanding or apperception that complicates the idea of reality, I think, in an incredibly rich way.
Did you want to say?
Well, I agree that nature is beautiful. But you mentioned reality, and scientists don't really know what reality is.
I know. But they say beautiful things about it.
They say
all the
beautiful
time.
things about it. I mean, I think, philosophers, if anybody knows what reality is, it might be philosophers. Scientists certainly don't claim to know what reality is. Scientists, what we know as scientists is the readings of voltmeters, and what science is about for us is the ability to predict where that needle is going to go when you hook it up to a certain electrical circuit.
I think you're too modest.
Well, we have theories, and I would say even beautiful theories,
There you go.
mathematically beautiful theories that try to predict where that needle is going to go, and those theories have internal beauties, but ultimately we're not saying anything about reality. Reality is, to me, is a very abstract conception. That all we really know is our experience with the world.
Well, I mean, I agree that reality is a very elusive, I mean, it depends on the scale at which your attention falls on it, what it appears to be, etc., But if that is true, then, I mean, for example, if you show a theory to another scientist, and he says that is not elegant, he's made a statement that he thinks has something to do with reality, right? If you say it's beautiful, that has something to do with reality.
Well, no. Now, I'm totally in agreement with you that scientific theories can be beautiful, as well as the objects they describe. But what science has found, remarkably, is that the theories that we human beings deem elegant happen to be the ones that agree most closely with where that needle is going to point on the voltmeter. So when a scientist says to another scientist that theory is inelegant, it's not elegant, I don't think that she means that the theory doesn't correspond to reality. I think that she means that the theory probably is not going to agree with experiment, because we have found that elegance and our aesthetic judgments seem to accord with the behavior of nature, which is a miracle in itself.
But I love your language, but but if you can use the word beauty and be mutually intelligible, and it has a predictive power in terms of your meter, if that's what you want to say, then beauty exists.
I certainly
part
agree.
of reality.
It exists in the sense that various people can look at a painting, let's say the Mona Lisa or some other painting that we know, Picasso, de Mademoiselle d'Avignon, and all feel that it's beautiful, or read one of your novels and you get a consensus that it's beautiful. Whether or not that means that beauty exists as an abstract concept out there in the universe, that's something that I don't know. But certainly if a lot of different people can agree that a particular thing is beautiful.
But if it disciplines thought, for example, that theory won't work, it is not beautiful. I mean, that's not just an aesthetic statement, it's a prediction about the utility.
It is. But again, I think it goes back to the remarkable fact that our aesthetic sense, which is related to what we consider to be beautiful, seems to accord with the workings of nature. Because by and large, the theories that we have thought were beautiful turned out to be the right ones. And when I say right, I mean in the sense that they're able to predict where the needle goes on the voltmeter.
But apart from the question of predictability and so on, there's another way in which philosophers of science talk about, I think, this conversation we're having, and that's the question of what are called emergent properties and emergent reality. And maybe that's another way to kind of get at this. That is, from the phenomena that as they occur in the natural world, there arise things like beauty, there arise things like consciousness, there arise what we might call mind, which on some accounts are just illusory, all right? And that's a certain version of an emergence theory as it plays itself out in philosophy debates about science, philosophical debates. But on other accounts, those are realities. They're real properties that emerge from the actualities of physical processes. Mm-hmm. Are you an emergentist by any chance, Alan, or an anti-emergentist?
Well, no, I agree with that, that there are properties of nature that cannot be understood in terms of the workings of the individual pieces, but when you put all the pieces together, you get something that is qualitatively different, not just quantitatively.
Well, might you agree with Marilynne that beauty might be one of those emergent properties?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the other way we do things in Washington. So I'm glad to say that at this point, I think this might not be a bad moment to do this. We actually have microphones set up in either of the two aisles. And for the interest of time, what we'd like to do is find out if those who would like to ask questions of Ms. Robinson or of the panel, if you would line up behind the two mics that we have here, we'll sort of go back and forth between the two aisles. So anyone who would like to make a comment, pose a question, we'd be delighted to have you sort of line up at this point. Again, they're sort of a third of the way up the aisle. And we'll get through as many as we can in the next 20 minutes or so, if anyone's interested in doing that. And let's see if anyone wants to come down. I think we have a couple people who are approaching. I'll just start over here on house left, stage right. Here you go.
Hello. Ooh, this is loud. Hi. I've really been enjoying this conversation. Thank you so much. I wanted to go back to something that Paul said about Marilynne as a teacher, Miss Robinson, that she embodied the virtue of her beliefs. And I wanted to sort of connect that to what you were just talking about beauty. Do you feel that experiencing beautiful objects, things, makes us better people?
I think that we're made better people by being attentive to beauty, perhaps in forms that have not yet been perceived as beautiful. I mean, I think it's much more a habit of mind that is called for rather than disciplining one's attention to what has already, by consensus, been called beautiful.
Very good.
In terms of the relationship between the spiritual and writing, when I was in high school, one of my papers was about Robert Graves and the white goddess, this whole concept that art and artists are merely conduits for the spiritual, and that either we work at it or we're chosen. How much do you feel that your, sort of the spirituality in this, when I would write music, when you used to be drummer in a band and so on, things happen that you don't plan ahead, and they come out in the story, and it sort of takes on a piece of its own, and you lose yourself You know, you don't start off with, this is what I'm going to say, but you lose yourself in that. And how much does that happen in terms of, let's say, your view of the art of writing that you're dealing with?
Oh, it happens a lot. I don't, you know, I don't trust what I'm writing unless it surprises me, you know. I don't, you know, the thing that has been really amazing to me is that I've written 2 books at a minimum that I considered deeply personal, deeply private books. I didn't really, until I got a letter from my agent, I didn't think I would ever publish Housekeeping. I just, you know, and then you put these things out into the world with luck, with, you know, help, and you find out that you have actually said something that resonates among many people, which is a very striking thing. And you know, it's one of those things I wish we articulated better. How, you know, I feel as if I write something that I don't truly control. I can just feel that there's a rightness that is emerging out of what I do. And then to have other people, you know, recognize it, when the whole point is that I'm writing something that you haven't read before, you know, I mean, it's, you know, it's an astonishing thing. I think that feeling that you have of having something pass through you is very much a result of the fact that you live very much more deeply in a culture than you realize that you do, or that you live in a human community more deeply than you realize, and that you really can talk to people in a way that's much more inward and, you know, than you would ever anticipate.
Great. Thank you.
This is going to be a tough one, I think. So I have a friend of mine who's an atheist, and he says that the entire Bible can be boiled down to "Thy will be done." And everything else in the Bible is people trying to discern what God's will is. And I'm thinking about the way you talk about science, and it sounds like you don't make a heck of a lot of distinctions between how much you apply beauty to good and evil and to tragedy and perseverance in your novels. So my question is, how do you discern God's will?
Wow.
15 minutes.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know, I cling to basic prohibitions, you know, no idolatry, no killing, no stealing. But you know what, I mean, again, this is, my life surprises me all the time. There are things that attract my interest, things that I want to do, I do them. They satisfy my do no harm ethic, and then they have another content beside, and I hope they're consistent with the will of God. I would find that to be a very pleasing idea. Who knows, you know?
Did I imagine this, or did you boil down the Bible somewhat differently at one point into cut it out?
Yeah, exactly. Why do the nations so furiously rage together? Stop doing that.
And could you, while we're on doing discerning God's will, we haven't talked about your book about Sellafield at all, and I just wondered if you might say a few words about that.
Well, you know, the main book of my entire career, from my point of view, is a book that nobody else has read virtually, called Mother Country. Thank you for your attention. It's about a plutonium reprocessing plant on the coast of England that has made the Irish Sea the most radioactive body of water in the world. It's a whole elaborate, hideous industry that involves building reactors that have wastes that cannot be stored over time. They're graphite-moderated reactors. They've sold them all over the world, or they're built all over the world, and then these things come back to the coast of England to be stripped down into a form that will not, you know, combust or burn, whatever, as these wastes would do otherwise. They can't be stored like pressurized water reactor wastes have been so far. So in any case, to strip these things down requires, you know, nitric acid, so on, a great deal of what is derived from these wastes are bomb-grade plutonium, bomb-grade uranium, etc., and other saleable isotopes, whatever out of this very inefficient system of stripping down that's been going on since the 50s. It goes down a pipeline into the Irish Sea. And this has happened for so long at such a scale that it has affected the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, so on. And I need hardly mention Ireland itself. I wrote about this because I was living in England and I got information from various respectable sources like the London Times that this was going on. So I wrote the book about it. People in England read it. They talk to me about it. They're not shocked by it because, of course, it does come from places like the Times. People in the United States are not attracted to the subject. They don't want to know that this is going on so very near Dove Cottage. What are you going to do? So that's Sellafield.
Wow.
And I did feel that I was religiously obligated to write that book.
Good.
Each of you has used the word belief more than once in this really lovely and lively conversation. In a rather straightforward, orthodox, if you will, understanding, belief is an intellectual assent to a propositional statement. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so on and so forth. I wonder if you can say something more about the relationship between belief and story, or perhaps faith and narrative, that complicates belief a little bit more.
I think that I don't have a creedal sort of belief. Yes, I can recite the Apostles' Creed without difficulty, but at the same time, I don't feel belief at all as if it were itemized and if there were boxes I had to check or anything like that. For me, it's basically a posture of questioning of, what is in this moment, what is in this event, with the assumption that everything is incredibly precious, that nothing that happens, however inexplicable, is done without reference to the fact that everything is very precious, So I don't find it's not a state of repose for me. And it's not dependent, the creedal sorts of statements are fine, but they are human origin, I would say, and maybe some of them are not exactly on the point, That's fine with me,
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
We go to the other side, if I can.
First, I'd just like to say that it's an honor to be in the presence of so many of my favorite writers, so thank you for bringing this conversation together. Marilynne, I've read Gilead more than once and deeply loved the book, and I think one of the most powerful aspects of Gilead is the complicated relationships between fathers and sons in a general sense, and I think a lot of times readers focus on one of those relationships between a father and a son, but for me it's the trio of the grandfather, the father, and the son. And I think history is so pervasive in Gilead, and I think it's so important in the three generations, and the messages that Gilead is conveying. And I'd like you to speak more about that relationship between history and fatherhood. And I mean, in this moment in time, I just can't help but think about the importance of abolitionist history and the moment that we're in, and that the narrator Ames, thinks so much about his grandfather and the abolitionist moment that he lived in, and he's living in the civil rights moment.
Yes. When I went to Iowa, I'd always lived either in Idaho or Massachusetts or Rhode Island. I was always, one end of the country or the other. And then I found myself in Iowa, so I wanted to know what the history of the place was, what the culture of the place was, and inevitably Iowans would say it has no history. Just, you know, and of course, I mean, you can't have two people in one room for 3 hours without having a history. And so I started doing all kinds of primary research, you know, 19th century writers of various sorts and so on. And I found out that there's this beautiful forgotten history of these little towns that on what was then the frontier that were established in order to inculcate an ethic of abolitionism in the Middle West, very successful at that. They tend to be based around colleges. One of the things that struck me when I moved into the Middle West is that the oldest buildings on the landscape are typically little colleges or churches or churches, you know. These people would buy land from the government, which was very cheap. They would build a college, you know, they had patrons. They would build a college, some congregation from Massachusetts or somewhere would come out there and settle the place. And then when people moved west, they wanted to be near a college or a church, you know. And so the property values would go up, and then they would use it to underwrite these things that they had built and also to start new towns with new colleges and new churches and so on. And so you got what was crucially important for American history, a very anti-slavery Middle West that produced people like Lincoln and Grant and Sherman and so on, and also a tremendous portion of the Union Army in the period, the later stages of the war. So, you know, so I saw for myself a remarkable history of very, very great importance that was forgotten, you know, within a very short period of time. I mean, here the people are still living among these things, going to these schools and so on, and still have many of the sort of cultural qualities that came from them, like, for example, no segregation in schools, no anti-miscegenation laws, these kinds of things, you know? So anyway, the phenomenon of historical forgetfulness at that level, with all the loss that is suffered, because people were out there doing admirable things that if we had persisted in them would have saved us all kinds of misery and, you know, reinventions of wheels and so on. I mean, people actually thought when I was a child that integrating schools was a novel idea, when these parts of the country had integrated schools before the Civil War, you know? And so the cultural forgetfulness can be just a devastating loss. And that's one of the things that's a major subject in the Gilead novels.
Okay. Let me say that we're down to our last few minutes, and perhaps what we can do is I'll take each half of the room in turn. We have 3 on this side, 2 on that, and perhaps if we could take the 3 folks that are lined up over here, and if you could each just ask your questions in turn, we'll store them up and then see what parts of them either Marilynne Robinson or any members of the panel might respond to. So we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you all for being here tonight. This was lovely. So early on in the conversation, someone mentioned the setting of Gilead, not being able to imagine Gilead in a time after Time magazine could have the cover asking, "Is God dead?" And as someone whose consciousness doesn't exceed too far back through the distance, I wonder in a lot of these conversations what sort of spiritual consciousness has been, if it has been lost, how do we articulate that as something more than maybe just declining church attendance? And then following on to that question, where do you all find the most interesting and compelling articulation and of faith and imagination moving forward, especially in our public conscience?
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks. I actually wanted to ask about Mother Country, so I'm glad someone else brought it up on the stage, Geraldine Brooks. It's a very striking book. I was very intrigued by the premise of Mother Country, which is basically that, or one of the premises, that America has a more generous social ethic than at least Great Britain in certain respects. And the book delves into not only the actual nuclear power plant, but also the history of British social reform and the principles that informed it. I was wondering whether you could comment on how you interpret kind of current political events in America in light of the principles of sort of British social teaching and then American social norms that you investigated in that book.
Thank you. This has been a really enlightening conversation in many ways. My question is really prompted by the gentleman who asked about belief and by your response, and is motivated because in my own life and in my own research, I think much more about religious practice than I do about religious belief. And when you speak about belief as not a static place, I'm wondering about practice. I'm wondering about moments when belief falters, and I'm also wondering about the ways in which people enact and live out their commitments and those actions, and just what kinds of connections you would make between belief and practice, and what practice might look like sometimes in the absence or the faltering of belief.
Well, you know, I think that I don't think of belief as faltering. I think of myself as faltering. I mean, it's just, it happens to be true that, you know, this sort of fusion of the aesthetic and the metaphysical and the scientific, so far as I understand, is very satisfying to me. It seems freestanding to me, you know, and if I find myself not sufficient to it, I don't blame it. You know what I mean? I don't. I think that any religion teaches practice, and I think that certainly Judeo-Christianity teaches generosity and compassion, and that is the essential practice, I think, in both of those faiths. And I think also that faith is rejuvenated by the practices that are central to it, like compassion. As far as, you know, England and America, there's always been a very complex relationship between them that is economic as much as anything. If you look at laws that controlled the working class in 19th century England, and you look at the laws that controlled the enslaved people in the South, they're almost identical, you know. There's a history of exploitation of the working class that in England that is, you know, I mean, people used to talk about wages slavery. That was the term for it, you know, and they had every reason to call it that. The movement, the impetus behind the kind of economics that I criticize in Mother Country as being British is simply the idea that everything at best is reduced to liquid money. That's capital. That means, you know, you squeeze the money out of here and you can put it there, and squeeze the money out and put it there. So, you know, if we, for example, start selling national assets, we will be taking on economic assumptions that are very close to our British origins. The idea that actually capital, to use, you know, Marx's word, is the ultimate form of property, and that anything else is basically reducible to, it has the value of what can be reduced to in terms of liquid wealth. That's why you get things like Sellafield. That was certainly my conclusion. It generates a great deal of money, and the cost of it is not a cost that is felt by the people who appreciate the wealth that is generated by it. When you have that assumption, you know, all sorts of barriers go down.
So the first question, just want to pick up one element of it, which I thought was kind of intriguing. Do you feel, having set your novels, as was said at the very outset, in the distant but not too distant past, at a time before the death of God rhetoric entered the culture, have we lost a spiritual identity since then, or is it just a continuation of the same story? Do you see a discontinuity there, and where do you see the seeds of hope in terms of what might be a spiritual element in today's culture?
Well, you know, I have traveled around quite a bit in Europe as well as the United States, and especially in Europe, interestingly enough, and Britain, I'm asked about theology. I've given long newspaper interviews about theology in Italian newspapers. It's really quite striking. I have come to the conclusion that the secularism of the Western world is about 1/8 of an inch deep. And that thinking in other terms, thinking in spiritual terms of faith, comes profoundly naturally to people. And that they're simply embarrassed to engage a kind of, thinking that people will call naive. We're so terrified of that word, So I don't think, there's this other conversation that goes bubbling along at the surface, God is dead and all this kind of stuff, which of course is in one of Luther's, to speak of the radical event of the crucifixion, he uses the sentence, God is dead. So it has even a religious context before Nietzsche made it into something else. In any case, there was no such event. All it is simply saying to the public, shh, we're supposed to pretend we don't believe that stuff anymore.
Thanks.
But I just think it's contrary to human nature to say, faith was something that kept us going while we were young and impressionable, and then it just vanished away. I don't think that's descriptive of it at all.
Thank you. So quickly, just the last two questions, if we could just get those uttered, and then we'll see if we have time to maybe say something very brief about them.
Absolutely. I hope I can take just a second to thank you all for a wonderful, enlightening talk, and you, Marilynne, especially, for a series of just powerful, moving novels. I heard you all talk quite a bit about some of the visionary aspects of faith and belief and the role of beauty in Calvin's thought in particular. And one of the things that was striking to me in the Gilead trilogy is a sort of different strain of Calvin's thought, is the use of the doctrine of total depravity, the way that Jack Boughton conceives of his own experience, his fears that he might be damned, and the sort of wrought difficulty that that especially Ames and Boughton's father have in trying and not quite succeeding at forgiving him, at not being able perhaps to play the role of the father of the prodigal son in the way that they want to. And so I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the relationship between those visionary aspects of religious thought and the moral drama that we find especially in the second half of Gilead.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, well, Jack doesn't, Robert Boughton does nothing but forgive Jack. Moment to moment, his whole theology is based on forgiving Jack. Jack doesn't forgive himself. Every theology has complex working parts, and the idea of falling short is, I think, intrinsic in every theology, and to experience beautiful demonstrations of belief and forgiveness and all the rest of it doesn't necessarily mean that you're all right. You know what I mean? So I'm talking basically about what I consider to be a phenomenon of faith that is very general in religious traditions. And at least Jack has the ultimate benefit that it's really not up to him. He can't know, and it's a new roll of the dice every time someone goes to his reward.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Very last question, briefly.
This question is for anyone on the panel. The way everyone has been speaking this evening about beauty reminded me of a radio story that many people in the audience might have heard recently about a man who lost the ability to produce testosterone, and he describes for these few months, he experiences everything as being beautiful, but in a he describes it as a completely objective way. He just stops judging things, and he would see, a crack in the sidewalk and think that's beautiful. I maybe should add at this point that women also have testosterone as well. But at the same time, he also lost all motivation to do anything as well. And I was just wondering if maybe this presents a kind of metaphor about a certain tension between not judging things and experiencing them as beautiful as they are, and a certain tension with acting and imposing your will on the world in a way where you might have a certain vision of beauty of your own that you maybe also want to interact with the material or outside world.
So your concern is what effect beauty might have on agency? It might be in some ways debilitating?
Or not a lack of judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody want to take that? Got a quick response to that, Paul?
Well, why me? No. I think it's easy to become habituated to acculturated thinking. So I think it's easy to become habituated to thinking that what you think is thought, when in fact it is not thinking. I think I got that. 3 negatives make a positive. And so I think it's, at least in the context of how we've been talking about it up here, is that it's on a certain level, it's a technical skill, or it's an actual, it's almost like a muscle. You have to habituate yourself to the discipline of seeing beauty, but it's a kind of beautiful paradoxical kind of discipline, because what it is, it's cultivating the ability to stop imposing your will on what you see. And so, this is very anecdotal, but just reserving judgment, not acting as if you know what you're looking at, and really trying to cultivate the habit of being, I said it earlier, but in that kind of strict sense, being innocent. You don't know what you're looking at. And then a crack in the pavement is likely to be quite beautiful and have its own little, ecosystem or something, And the idea too that the closer you and the more sustained attention is, the more depth of the universe observation will always accommodate whatever depth of observation you choose to lend to it. So it will always come into more and more beautiful resolution. And I think that's one of the things that we talk about a lot, juxtaposition, and how you kind of a dialectic between the infinite and the infinitesimal, and the way that you can go down to the smallest, tiniest detail, and it's just so beautiful, and then suddenly it just will open back up onto the whole universe in a certain way. It's almost like a feedback loop or something. That's just my...
So I think that sounds to me like the right balance of testosterone.
That's what you're shooting for. Just like it's a little high today.
Right. We are actually at the end of our time, because we have a couple more things to do, and I'm going to turn the program back to the director of the John W. Kluge Center, Ted Widmer. Before I do so, let me ask you to join me in thanking our guest of honor and the panel.
What a wonderful, inspiring evening. Thank you so much for coming out. Let's not only applaud our prize winner, but our panelists and moderator who did such a good job tonight.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.